The shadow in the garden history is filled with stories that refuse to die. Some are carved into stone, others survive only because generation after generation refuse to let them disappear. Yet among all the forgotten names scattered across human history, one continues to return: a woman who was never introduced in the Bible, yet whose name has become known across the world. Her name is Lilith. To some, she was Adam's first wife, the woman who stood beside the first man before Eve ever entered the Garden of Eden. They believe she was created from the same earth as Adam, equal in every way, until a conflict between them changed the course of history forever. Others reject that idea completely. They argue that Lilith was never part of the biblical story at all, but a legend that emerged centuries later through folklore, mythology, and medieval imagination. So who is right? Was Lilith a forgotten figure whose story was erased from scripture, or is she a legend that grew so powerful it became mistaken for history? For centuries, theologians, historians, scholars, and storytellers have wrestled with these questions. Entire books have been written. Countless debates have unfolded, and even today the mystery continues to divide opinion. But perhaps we have been asking the wrong question, instead of asking whether Lilith was real. Perhaps we should ask why her story has survived for so long. Why does a woman who never appears in the opening chapters of Genesis continue to fascinate millions of people around the world? How did her name become one of the most recognizable figures in religious folklore? And what does her story reveal about the way myths are created, transformed, and passed from one generation to the next? These questions take us far beyond the Garden of Eden. They lead us into ancient civilizations. Forgotten manuscripts, religious traditions, and centuries of human imagination, because history is rarely as simple as it first appears. Sometimes the greatest mysteries are not hidden inside what ancient texts tell us. They are hidden inside what they leave unsaid. Over the next few minutes, we will follow the evidence wherever it leads. We will examine the biblical account of creation. We will explore the ancient civilizations that existed long before the book of Genesis was written. We will uncover the medieval writings that transformed an obscure name into one of history's most enduring legends. And finally, you will ask whether Lilith belongs to history, to mythology, or to something far more powerful: the evolution of human storytelling itself. Our purpose is not to prove a belief, nor is it to dismiss one. Our goal is much simpler: to separate scripture from folklore, history from legend, evidence from speculation. Because every civilization leaves behind a code. Hidden within its stories, its traditions, and its mysteries. Today, we attempt to decode one of the oldest. This is the ancient code. To understand the legend, we must begin where every investigation should: the text itself. Open the book of Genesis and something unusual appears. Genesis chapter 1 declares male and female he created them. But move to chapter 2 and the perspective shifts entirely. Adam is formed from the dust, and because it is not good for man to be alone, God puts him into a deep sleep and forms Eve from his rib. For centuries, readers have asked a simple question: why are there two creation accounts? Are they two different traditions stitched together by ancient editors, or is one a summary while the other provides the detail? The Bible itself never answers. More importantly, it never mentions the name Lilith, not once. But for ancient readers staring at this gap in the text, that silence wasn't an answer, it was a space waiting to be filled. And sometimes, history's greatest legends are born not from what a text says, but from what it leaves unsaid. We are drawn to the gaps. When a story leaves a void, the human imagination naturally reaches out to bridge that distance. We want to know the who, the why, and the what if. This impulse is not a modern phenomenon, it is an ancient one. It is the very engine of myth-making. But if we are going to understand who, or what Lilith really is, we have to stop looking at the silence of the Bible and start looking at the roar of history. We have to travel back to a time before Israel, before the desert, and before the story of Eden was even written down. We have to step into the cradle of civilization, where the night was not just a time of day, but a realm of spirits that demanded to be named. The roots in the shadows. Long before ancient Israel, before Jerusalem, and before the Hebrew Bible was compiled, another civilization flourished in the fertile plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, Mesopotamia. Here, in the cradle of human history, the world was experienced as a place of raw, untamed forces. The night was not merely the absence of light, it was a living, breathing domain filled with unseen dangers. To the ancient Babylonians and Sumerians, the dark brought windstorms, disease, infant mortality, and terrors that the human mind struggled to comprehend. To explain these fears, they gave them names. Among the spirits that haunted the ancient imagination were the Lilitu, a class of wind-borne demons and nocturnal phantoms associated with darkness, storms, and desolation. Ancient cuneiform tablets and artifacts, such as the famous Burney relief depicting a winged, bird-footed figure flanked by owls and lions, reveal an early iconography of these supernatural entities. These figures were not wives or companions, they were personifications of chaos. They were forces of nature that preyed upon the vulnerable in the dead of night, demanding protection, incantations, and rituals to keep them at bay. For centuries, these ideas echoed through the ancient Near East. Empires rose, conquered, and turned to dust. Languages shifted, religions transformed. Yet old motifs rarely die, they migrate. As centuries passed, elements of these ancient Near Eastern night spirits crossed cultural and linguistic boundaries, filtering into later Jewish folklore during the periods of exile and cultural exchange. But the transformation was not immediate. It took a bridge of centuries, and the fertile imaginations of medieval writers, to turn a storm spirit of ancient Babylon into the iconic figure of human history. Sometime during the Middle Ages, a remarkable and provocative text emerged into the intellectual world, the alphabet of Ben Sira. Within its pages, the ancient wind spirit underwent a radical metamorphosis. For the very first time, Lilith was no longer described as a demon of the night air. She was given a human story, a voice, and a role at the very beginning of creation. According to this medieval text, God did not just create Adam, he simultaneously created a woman from the earth, Lilith, making them absolute equals. But equality in the garden proved to be short-lived. When Adam demanded that Lilith submit to him, positioning her beneath him both physically and socially, she refused. She looked at her creator and her companion, and rather than yielding, she pronounced the secret, ineffable name of God, took flight into the air, and vanished into the wild edges of the Red Sea. It was a striking narrative of rebellion, autonomy, and defiance. But it raises a critical question that every historian must ask. Is this history, or is it literature? The answer shapes everything we know about how human culture preserves its deepest questions. The evolution of the archetype. Perhaps we have been asking the wrong question all along. Instead of demanding to know whether Lilith physically existed in the dawn of time, we should ask a much deeper, more revealing question. Why did people need Lilith to exist? Every civilization builds its own mythology, not simply to entertain, but to explain the unexplainable, to warn against social transgression, and to make sense of deep-seated human anxieties. Legends do not appear out of a vacuum. They are molded by the values, fears, and structures of the societies that tell them. To the medieval world that penned and preserved her story, Lilith was a cautionary tale. In an era defined by rigid hierarchies, communal conformity, and strict patriarchal order, she represented the ultimate breakdown of authority. She was the disruption of the cosmic and social balance. To early audiences, her flight from Eden was not an act of liberation, but a terrifying warning of the chaos that follows when order is abandoned. She became the face of temptation, the midnight specter who threatened the vulnerable, and the embodiment of pride punished. Yet, as centuries turned, culture shifted, and with it, the meaning of the myth. By the time of the Renaissance and the Romantic era, artists, poets, and writers began to look at the shadows of Eden with fresh eyes. The archetype underwent a profound transformation. Lilith was no longer painted purely as a monster of the dark. She became a creature of tragic beauty, mystery, and forbidden allure. She appeared in paintings, poetry, and literature as the dark mirror to Eve, the wild, untamed counterpart to the obedient mother of humanity. And as we crossed into the modern era, the evolution took its most radical turn yet. In contemporary culture, the medieval demon and the rebellious first wife has been entirely reclaimed. Today, Lilith is frequently invoked not as a symbol of terror, but as an icon of independence, autonomy, and resistance. She represents the voice that refuses to be silenced, the individual who chooses exile over submission, and the archetype of the modern feminist narrative. This is the true power of folklore. A story born from ancient wind demons and medieval text fragments did not die out because it is not a fixed historical event. Instead, it survived for over 1,000 years precisely because it is elastic. It changes shape to fit the psychological and cultural needs of every generation that adopts it. Every era gets the Lilith it deserves. But to truly understand her place in our cultural landscape, we have to look past the single narrative and examine the various lenses through which history views her. 4 lenses and the final reflection. So, how are we to understand her today? When we strip away the layers of centuries of storytelling, poetry, and debate, we find that Lilith is viewed through 4 distinct intellectual lenses. The first is the scriptural perspective. From this viewpoint, the text of the Hebrew Bible is precise. Lilith is never presented as Adam's first wife. For traditional scholars, theologians, and believers, the absence of her name from Scripture means the historical investigation of a first wife concludes before it even begins. Genesis tells the story it intends to tell, and any figures outside of that text belong to later human invention. The second is the folklore perspective. This lens embraces the rich, imaginative expansions found in texts like the alphabet of Ben Sira. Folklorists recognize that communities often generate narratives to fill the gaps left by sacred texts. In this light, the legend of Lilith is a vital piece of cultural history, a window into how medieval thinkers wrestled with autonomy, gender dynamics, and the complexities of human relationships. The third is the historical perspective. Historians trace the continuous evolution of the figure, connecting the dots from ancient Mesopotamian wind spirits to medieval Jewish mysticism and modern literature. Through this academic lens, Lilith is not a single, continuous entity, but a cultural mirror, an idea that absorbed the fears, hopes, and anxieties of every civilization it passed through. And finally, the modern perspective. Today, Lilith has been transformed into a cultural symbol of autonomy, individualism, and resistance. She represents the voice that refuses to be suppressed, and the archetype of the independent spirit who chooses freedom over compliance. None of these 4 perspectives invalidate the others. Instead, they demonstrate why the story has endured. Perhaps the greatest mystery was never whether Lilith existed. Perhaps the greatest mystery is us. Human beings have always searched for meaning inside silence. When history leaves questions unanswered, we write stories. When sacred texts leave space, we imagine. Sometimes those imagined stories become more powerful, more magnetic, and more enduring than the facts that inspired them. Whether Lilith was a forgotten woman, a literary creation, or simply the shadow cast by humanity's own imagination, one truth remains. Legends reveal as much about the people who create them as they do about the worlds they describe. Today, we have journeyed through history, myth, and evidence to separate documented fact from enduring legend. This is the ancient code. In our next episode, we step out of the garden and into the shadows of history. Who were the Nephilim, and does the evidence for giants really exist?